Perfect. So Benjamin War from NS Lyon will talk about quantum trajectories and feedback based on the measurement of decoherent channel in qubit.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. So we will talk about our latest experiments on quantum trajectories and feedback based on the decoherence channel of a qubit. So we will work on a single, a very simple system, a two-level system, a quantum two-level system. And what I'd like to show you is that we can now, using very precise detectors, we can take the role of the environment and measure what the environment sees about the system, so namely a dephasing and a relaxation of the qubit. And we can determine, like in the previous talk, what are the trajectories that follow the quantum state of the qubit as a function of time. So we are actually in process of moving. So these experiments have been performed, in fact, at École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and we are moving next month in Lyon, École Normale Supérieure also. So as I mentioned, the system we are going to consider is simply a two-level system, and the two main decoherence channels that exist for this qubit are the relaxation channel by coupling the qubit to a bath, which we will consider at zero temperature. The qubit can emit photons by spontaneous emission, and by dephasing. So if we now couple the qubit to another system that measures the state of the qubit, so its occupation, its excitation, the determination of the energy of the qubit induces a dephasing of the qubit if we don't read out the information. So as I was mentioning, what we're going to do is take the role of the environment and place a detector on the path of this dephasing channel, so as to detect what is the energy state of the qubit, what is the excitation of the qubit. So this kind of apparatus, I'll show you how we can make them with superconducting circuits. It can extract part of the dephasing channel, a significant fraction of the dephasing channel, and so this leads to a measurement record, which is a trace, let's say a list of real numbers, which we call a W as a function of time. And reciprocally, it's also possible and from this measurement record, what we will do is determine, as a function of time, at each time step, we will determine the state of the system conditioned on the fact that we have measured this record. So it's a conditional probability in the quantum sense. Now, there is another kind of detector we can use, which is the detection of the spontaneously emitted photons that go out of the qubit. And this is using a second type of detectors, here called the B detectors. And again, from them, we will get a measurement record by detecting part of the emitted photons. And from this record, we will get a conditional state, conditioned on this record, which is the quantum trajectory rho B. And now, in this experiment, now that we have these two set of detectors, we can combine them and use and try to see how we can take into account the two measurement records that are taken simultaneously on this system, which in fact can be even incompatible. So if we know that if we measure a quantum spin along the z and the x direction at the same time, this is a set of incompatible measurements due to the measurement back action. So we can wonder here what is going to happen. So this is this kind of experiments was done using X and Y measurements at the same time by the group of Irfan Siddiqui last year, and here we are extending this to measurement of dephasing and relaxation. So from these two measurement records, we will get now a quantum trajectory which takes into account both records. So experimentally, this measuring quantum trajectories has been done in mostly two systems only. So the first one is the system of the state of a cavity, where Rydberg atoms go through the cavity, and this will be the subject of the talk of Michel tomorrow morning, I think. And in this system, the system is in this setup, the system is the cavity mode. The pointer state are the Rydberg atoms that go through, and the environment which measures the pointer is the ionization and acceleration of the Rydberg atoms. For superconducting circuits, such as the systems we will discuss in this talk, the system is a superconducting qubit. The pointer state is a propagating microwave signal, and the environment is a linear amplifier, which will amplify these microwave photons and to a level that we can read out. So precisely in the spectrum in the electromagnetic spectrum, the system we consider, the quantum systems, are these microwave modes at about 2 to 20 gigahertz. So they're well below their optical counterparts, and so at room temperatures, while the visible photons are indeed cooled down. So at room temperature, if you compare HF to KBT, you see that at thermal equilibrium, the visible light is in its ground state. This is not the case for microwave photons, which are highly thermally populated. And so in order to do quantum physics experiments with microwave modes, we need to cool down these microwave modes, and we do that using a dilution refrigerator, which goes down to about 10 millikelvin, where indeed these microwave modes can be prepared in the ground state just by thermal equilibrium, and from then we can do quantum experiments. The support for these microwave modes are simply geometrical structures made out of superconducting metals. So, for instance, 3D aluminum cavities, such as this one, where here you can see a simulation of the electromagnetic field of the first resonant mode of this cavity at about 8 gigahertz. The quality factors of these kind of very simple cavities is about 1 million. So as you can see, it's thanks to superconductivity, they are very low dissipation objects, and so that so that we can do quantum experiments with them. But we also use coplanar waveguide cavities on chip or a microstrip. It doesn't really matter, but what matters is that these geometrical structures host a series of resonant modes, and we will work on typically the ground, the mode which has the smallest frequency out of the bunch. And this mode, this particular mode, will model it as an LC oscillator, which we can quantize, and this creates a harmonic oscillator with an operator A for the annihilation of a photon inside of this mode. So in order to so if we were to stay at this level of harmonic oscillator, if we were to drive such a harmonic oscillator using a classical microwave generator, we will only be restricted to a class of states which are classical, which are called the coherent states. It would be impossible to prepare, for instance, the Fock state 1. For that, we need a nonlinearity somewhere, and in the case of superconducting circuits, we use a tunnel junction made out of two superconducting electrodes. It's called the Josephson junction, and here is an example you can see of an electron beam microscope image of such a junction made out of two aluminum electrodes, which are superconducting, and separated by an insulator, which is alumina. And the Hamiltonian of this system now is not anymore that of an inductor. It's not a parabola as before. It's actually a cosine function of the flux, and so that instead of having equally separated energy levels, we now have energy levels that get closer and closer as the energy goes up, and this anharmonicity is the key to generating non-classical states or doing non-classical manipulations of the field. There are two important regimes that we are going to use for various purposes. So one is the case where this the anharmonicity, so the energy you lose by climbing up the ladder of energy levels, this alpha number here. So if alpha, if the anharmonicity is much larger than the dissipation rate, it's the strongly anharmonic regime where we can isolate two energy levels, for instance, out of the bunch. So if we send a wave at the frequency omega naught to the system, you see that the dynamics will be restricted to the first two levels, 0 and 1, and this creates effectively a qubit. So these will be the superconducting qubits we're going to use. Reciprocally, if the dissipation rate kappa is much stronger than the anharmonicity alpha, this looks very much like a harmonic oscillator, but which is slightly harmonic. And this is the regime that we are going to use to realize the detectors. We are going to realize the parametric amplifiers out of this regime. So just to give you an idea of the status of the field, so this is a slide I borrowed to Michel Devoret. So this is the Yale's perspective on the evolution of the qubit lifetime as a function of Yale for the superconducting circuits. And as you can see, indeed, the qubit lifetime increases quite rapidly, has increased quite rapidly over the last 2 decades, and up to the point that it has reached the supposed point where we can do quantum error correction on these circuits. On the side of amplifiers, of detectors, there are a lot of possible ways to use these circuits as amplifiers now. So I'd like to distinguish three families. So one is the case of degenerate amplifiers, like the Josephson parametric amplifier or many other devices, including one which is done here at Saclay. There are also the non-degenerate amplifiers, which can naturally amplify a field in a phase-preserving manner, so that the two quadratures can be amplified at the same time. This is the kind of amplifier we do in Paris. And a new kind of amplifier is a traveling wave amplifier, which offers now a very large bandwidth with excellent performances. The particular setup that we're going to use to investigate these quantum trajectories is then a coupled harmonic oscillator, which is a cavity in copper this time, coupled to a superconducting qubit, which is just made by the single tunnel junction out of aluminum. And the simplest way to characterize this circuit is by a Hamiltonian, which is that of a harmonic oscillator, so number of photons times the frequency. For the qubit, it's simply the qubit excitation probability times the energy of the qubit. And the coupling is done by this term, which essentially you see is given by the product of the number of photons in the cavity and the number of excitations in the qubit, so 0 or 1. And so now that we have set the frame of these experiments, let me first look with you at an ideal experiment where we would like to see a quantum jump of an atom. So let's consider a two-level system, which starts either in the excited state or in the E plus G state. So here is a representation of the excitation. Here it's a representation of sigma x. So sigma x is so when you're in 1, you're in E plus G, and when you're in -1, you're in E minus G. So you start, you see, from either E or E plus G. And then the qubit decays. It radiates by spontaneous emission photons out of it. And so we can wonder what is the state of the qubit as a function of time. So if we don't watch, if we don't look, the state will simply indicate an average decay of the excitation, which will either go exponentially fast with a rate gamma 1 or a typical time t1 from excited to ground, or from G plus E over square root of 2 to ground. So this is the average behavior. But now we can wonder what happens if we, instead of simply letting the photons go out, we watch them. So what happens if we now have an array of detectors and we look at a click which would indicate that, that a photon came out. So here is an example of a record that we could get. So we would get 0 click as a function of time, and at one particular time, click, there would be a photon that's detected. So now the trajectory is very different. So first of all, it's the state of the system would remain pure if the detectors were perfect, so that the trajectory will stay on top of the sphere instead of going inside of the sphere as before here, where it indicates that we lose some information. So here we don't lose any information. The entropy stays 0, and you see the shape of this evolution is a rotation, is a decay out of the sphere, on top of the sphere, but not especially exponentially. And at the typical time, at the time where you detect the event of the photon that comes out, the state of the qubit suddenly jumps to the ground state. So can one experimentally do this? Well, it's not easy. It's not easy because of the fact that these to have a single atom and have an array of detectors around it, is fairly difficult, and so it's hard to collect all the radiation that comes out and detect clicks. And so what was done in the past, in the 80s, is use an ancillary object to infer the fact that there was a jump or not. And so this was done with a trapped ion in the 80s, where they use an ancillary transition that they strongly drive in order to detect a jump in the two-level system. It was done on a different setup with Rydberg atom probing cavity jumps. So it's a bit the reciprocal of what we're going to do. So again, the system is the cavity and the probe is the atoms here. And it was done with a cavity probing the jumps of a qubit in superconducting circuits. So let me, as an introduction to these quantum trajectories, discuss this case, the case of a cavity probing the jumps of a qubit. So how does that work? So again, our system is a cavity coupled to superconducting circuits. The Hamiltonian, I've rewritten it a bit differently from what we saw earlier, so that we can see directly that the frequency of the cavity, which is the term proportional to the number of photons here, is now frequency of the cavity minus chi over 2 times the occupation of the qubit, well, chi times the occupation of the qubit, so that the cavity frequency now indicates the state of the qubit, if it's in the ground or excited state. And so at the output of this, so we send a drive at the input close to the cavity frequency, and we look at what's coming out of the cavity, and with the goal to detect the current frequency, the present frequency of the cavity, and so to infer the occupation of the qubit. So a drive like this, let's say the voltage we measure using the detector at the end of this chain can be decomposed classically as 2 quadratures, so I times cos omega t plus q times sine omega t. So quantally, this corresponds in fact to I and q being the real and the Hermitian and anti-Hermitian part of the propagating, the annihilation operator of the propagating field. And so if we look at what's coming out of this cavity, so if we don't drive, if there is nothing at the input, if we watch in this phase space of the 2 quadratures, so so let's say the cosine part and the sine part of the field, there are 0-point fluctuation, even though we are in the vacuum, and so that there is some uncertainty. If we do this experiment and try to measure the 2 quadratures of the field coming out, we will get a Gaussian distribution, which reflects the vacuum fluctuations of the field. Now, if we instead put at the input some a finite amplitude, then these vacuum fluctuations will be shifted by an amount which is given by the amplitude of the coherent field. So if we look now as a function of the frequency of the input at the phase of what's coming out, there are two possible curves we can get depending whether the qubit is in the ground or excited state. So if the qubit is in the ground state, the phase of the output field as a function of frequency will endure a pi phase shift, which indicates the frequency of the cavity when the qubit is in the ground state. And when the qubit is in the excited state, this pi phase shift occurs at a lower frequency. And this, so that you see now the experiment that we're going to do will be performed at the middle frequency, so that if we now detect a phase which is positive, we know the qubit is in the ground state, and negative, we will know the qubit is in the excited state. So, so this can be better seen in the quadrature phase space again. So at the output, we will get two possible amplitudes depending on the state of the qubit. Either the amplitude of the output field is as a positive imaginary part indicating the qubit is in ground state, or negative indicating the qubit is in the excited state. So in this picture I draw here, you see that at a given experiment we get a given point in this phase space, right? So if we get a point here, this means the qubit is in the ground state, and so we will have performed a strong measurement of the qubit state, a strong QND in the sense that the qubit is not destroyed. We can do a measurement later. So, so now let me show you what this gives on an actual experiment. So we start with the qubit on the excited state and measure this imaginary part. So we measure the imaginary part of the field coming out. So remember that if it's positive, so we will color it in orange, it indicates the qubit is excited. If it's negative, it indicates the qubit is in the ground state, and it will be in blue. So, so we can repeat this experiment. So here you see the qubit started in E, and at some time jumped down to the ground state. So this is the quantum jump. If we repeat, well, the time at which the qubit jumps from excited to ground is actually stochastic, and happens with some distribution. You could see, by the way, that there are some events of excitation, thermal excitation up. So if I now show you the distribution of the time at which the first jump occurs, you see that we get this distribution on about 1 million trajectories. And as you can see, the distribution obeys an exponential decrease as a function of time. Which is perfectly consistent with the relaxation of the qubit. So this was a strong measurement case where we see actually quantum jumps, like click events. But now the regime we're going to be interested in is a bit different. It's the case where the amplitude of the field that we send at the input is so small that actually the two possible cases corresponding to G or E for the qubit overlap for the field coming out. So if we now get a click here, if we measure this imaginary and real part of the amplitude coming out, you see that we cannot say for sure if the qubit is in the ground or excited state. So this is a weak measurement in the sense that if the uncertainty in this position in the quadratures that we measure originates from quantum noise, so 0-point fluctuation, then not only we cannot say that the qubit is ground or excited, but no one in the universe can say. And so that the qubit is not projected in ground or excited, it actually stays in the superposition of state if it's starting in the superposition of state. And so, so the measurement, the stochastic master equation formalism helps us to know what is the evolution of the state of the qubit in such a case. So here, so let's consider this case. So we now have a measurement which is let's say a voltage as a function of time, and we amplify this field using a Josephson parametric amplifier this time, so that we amplify a single quadrature. For instance, the one we are interested in here, which is the imaginary part of the field. So we get now a measurement record, W as a function of time. And W as a function of time corresponds on average to sigma z, so the occupation of the qubit, +1 if it's excited, -1 if it's in the ground state, plus a term which is so the noise. So this, remember the uncertainty that we got earlier due to 0-point fluctuation. So in fact, there is some finite efficiency eta between 0 and 1, which describes the efficiency of our detector, and which will say what part of this noise is quantum and what part is classical. And so from this measurement record, we can infer the state of the qubits as a function of time from a stochastic master equation. Okay, so this was the measurement type A, which measures the state of the qubit if it's in the ground or excited state. But in fact, we have a second type of detector, which is the detection of the spontaneously emitted photons. So indeed, instead of looking now at the frequency of the cavity, if we look at the frequency of the qubit itself, if we look at the field that is radiated out of the cavity by the qubit, and put a detector, which in our case is a Josephson mixer there, we can here measure the two quadratures of the field coming out. So Hermitian and anti-Hermitian part of the field coming out at the qubit frequency. And if we look at this, you see that on average, the mean signal coming out, so the amplitude of the field coming out, is given by a factor, which is the decay rate in square root, times the sigma minus operator. So sigma minus is the lowering operator of the qubit, which goes from excited to ground. And so that so by the way, sigma minus, so the jump, this jump operator, which describes this decay channel, is proportional to sigma minus, which is can be written as sigma x minus I sigma y over 2. So that if we measure, you see, the real and imaginary part of this signal, we will in fact have access to sigma x and sigma y via fluorescence. So this is what's written here. So we get, through this measurement of fluorescence, two measurement records this time, not a single one, two. One which we call U, which gives an average sigma x, plus some quantum noise, and V, which gives sigma y plus some quantum noise. So this is, so as before, we have this average and this noise, and if we use a stochastic master equation, out of these two measurement records, we can infer the state of the qubit at each time step. And this is, by the way, what we have done earlier for fluorescence only in this paper. But here we have the three sets of measurement records, U, V, and W, which indicate, on average, X, Y, and Z. So we have here a measurement which is quite interesting because by just raw averaging the measurement records, we get a direct measurement of the block vector. So we don't have to do any processing. If we, so here I show you two evolutions, two Hamiltonian evolutions in presence of measurements of a qubit. And just by doing a raw average of these three measurement records, we can plot the trajectory, the average trajectory. So here it's just average of the qubit as a function of time. So here you see a Rabi oscillation, which slowly decays towards the most entropic state. And here it's in a trajectory where we do strong measurements. So we do the measurement of sigma z is done in a strong manner, so that there is some Zeno blockade, which sets the qubit the most entropic state quite fast. By the way, you see here in blue the solution of the Lindblad equation. So indeed, we can reproduce these average trajectories using simply a master equation. So how does now the stochastic master equation work? So how do we find the state as a function of time and condition to the records? Well, so the first part to find the stochastic master equation is to find the master equation alone. So here we can write the evolution of the state of the qubit unconditioned to the measurements. So this is the density matrix of the qubit. We have a Hamiltonian evolution. So this is the Schrödinger equation. plus this Lindblad term, which takes into account the decoherence channels. So in our case, we have 3 decoherence channels. So one which is the dephasing, and 2 which are related to spontaneous emission, so sigma minus and I sigma minus. So these 2 terms are the same for sigma minus and I sigma minus, but not for, as you will see, for stochastic part. And so on top of this, we have some innovation. So this is the part we know on average. And now we have some innovation, which is the term which you have to add to the master equation to take into account the measured noise you just obtained into the new state of the qubit. So this term looks like this. Maybe let's not focus on its precise shape. And this what you need to input to this equation is the value of dW, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the measured noise. And you can see it here. So for a given measurement record, you have the average part plus dW. So you inject that, and that's it. Okay, so here is the final setup. So we have this qubit, which is driven at its frequency so that it can have some dynamics. So we can drive it with an amplitude we choose so that it can rotate between G and E at the speed we want. We can do a measurement with a measurement strength we can control in situ, and so that we can measure like this this W record which encodes the sigma z, so the excitation of the qubit. And at the same time, we always measure weekly the fluorescence, which indicates on average x and y. So we have x, y, and z at the same time, weekly measured on average. So here is what we get. So I will show you here an example of one experiment where we measure u, v, and w as a function of time, and here we plot the solution of the stochastic master equation depending on the 3 measurement records. And so this is how it looks. So here you can see the trajectory. So we just cut the trajectory to the last 3 microseconds here, and so all right. So we have some signal which looks like noise, but this noise is the input for the stochastic master equation, and so we see, as you can see, trajectories like this. So okay, so we can in fact do this for a second experiment. So this is now in red and green, it corresponds to these 2 measurement records, and so we get two solutions of the stochastic master equation. And so we may wonder, does this have any reality? I mean, this is just the result right now of a calculation out of these measured records, but what does it predict? So in fact, we can test the prediction of the stochastic master equation, and it's important to do it in the following way. So we can stop the stochastic master. We can stop the experiment at a given time, let's say 10 microseconds. And at 10 microseconds, what we do is we do a tomography of the qubit at this time. So we will do either a strong measurement of sigma x, or a strong measurement of sigma y, or a strong measurement of sigma z. And then what we do is, so we have now millions of trajectories, all right? We have millions of results of x, y, and z. And what we do is we are going to sort them by the prediction of the quantum trajectory. So let's say we are going to sort all the measurements of sigma z by what the trajectory predicts for the value that should have the z operator. And so let's say here, let's take this point as an example in this on this plot. So on this plot here, we take all the experiments for which the quantum trajectory predicts that z is equal to minus 0.5. And so we take that. We now look at the result of the tomography, so the strong measurement of sigma z for all these experiments, and average them. And as you can see, if the trajectories are right, we should get that the average value of the strong measurement of sigma z should be equal to the predicted one. And this is what you can see on all these 3 plots. You can see an agreement between the tomographic reconstruction of the qubit and the predicted value of the trajectory. So indeed, so there is, as you can see, a good match. So this is, in fact, how we currently estimate the efficiency of our detector. So a slight error on the efficiency here will completely deviate from this agreement. And actually, the shape could be very different if we make a mistake in the efficiency. That's one of the parameters of the stochastic master equation. And so that's so as you can see, these trajectories, which look as if they originate from something which is completely noisy, are in fact absolutely operational, have an operational meaning. So now let's so we have looked at 2 trajectories. So let's look at the statistics of them now, at millions of them. So I'm going to show you here the statistics of trajectories. So we will the time will vary, and at each time we will plot a distribution of trajectories in these cuts x, y on the plane. So these are projections on plane x, y, x, z, and y, z. And you will see also a 3D picture in the blocks here and histograms in x, y, and z. And so we are going to do it in a configuration where here we just use the measurement of sigma z. We don't we throw away the measurement of the fluorescence. We start from the ground state. There is a Rabi rotation at a speed which is faster than the decay, which is gamma 1 here. And we do a very strong measurement of sigma z at all times. So the strength of the measurement of sigma z is the strongest parameter in this process. So now this is what happens. So and on top of that, we show one trajectory in blue. So as you can see, there is not much happening in the planes x, y, and y, z, because we start with y equal to 0. We rotate around around y, so y stays 0. There is no back action on along y with this measurement of sigma z. And here, however, there is a lot of action. So by the Zeno effect, so maybe I should replay it. So the Zeno effect says that the qubit should be projected at each time, either in the ground or excited state. So this should say that the trajectory will jump from here to there. And as you can see, indeed, this particular trajectory which shows spends some time here and then jumps there and then goes back here. So this is what the Zeno effect does to the dynamics of a system. But if we were to look just at the average evolution, you see that we would just see this black line. It would go up and then down, and nothing very fancy would happen. But if we look at the trajectories, you see clearly that that this most entropic state results from, in fact, jumps between ground and excited state. But on top of that, since we have some Rabi drive, some Rabi oscillation, yes. So there is a tilt on top of it. So we localize the qubit either in ground or excited, but there is this rotation which makes it that there is a distortion. So depending on the direction of the Rabi drive, you see here that the excited state is in fact more localized a bit to the side of negative x values, and for the ground it's to the side of positive x values. Okay, so this is the case of the measurement of sigma z only. So let's take the same experiments, but we throw away the sigma z measurement and consider only the sigma minus measurement. So now, again with this big Zeno effect undergoing. So now this big Zeno effect, since we don't look at it, it's essentially just dephasing. So it's as if we were looking at the qubit, which dephases very rapidly, and so that what we get from the measurement of fluorescence here is a small spread of trajectories. But there is still something new. It's the fact that y is not 0 all the time. It's the fact that when you measure, when you take into account the back action of the measurement of fluorescence, you see that you can depart from y equal to 0 and explore a wider phase space. So then what happens if we do both at the same time? So if we take into account both sigma minus and sigma z, well, you see that we still have this jumpy behavior between ground and excited state in this xz plane. But on top of that, we have some structure in the xy and yz plane. And there is then some asymmetry you see between the two. So let's discuss it by looking at this kind of stationary state for the three types of trajectories. So here, what you see is this increase of the spread of the density matrices you get when you measure both at the same time compared to the other ones is precisely a measurement of the incompatibility between the two measurements. The fact that these two measurements of fluorescence and dispersive measurement do not commute, they correspond to operators which do not commute, says that there will be some additional spread on the trajectories in the Bloch sphere. And now the reason why there is some small spread on the right and a large spread on the left is linked to the fact that the sigma minus measurement, so this measurement of fluorescence, is not a QND measurement. It's a measurement where the pointer state, so the only state that does not vary with a sigma minus is the ground state. So that the back action of the fluorescence measurement is zero when you're in the ground state. If the system is in the ground state, no matter what you get at the output at the qubit frequency, you know that the system stays in the ground state. So there is no variation, no back action. On the other hand, if it's in the excited state, the back action is maximal. So the back action on the excited states will in fact induce a very large spread. And since we have this tilt, and since we map the ground state to positive value of x and the excited state to negative value of x, this means that for positive x we have a small spread because we're in the pointer state of fluorescence, and for negative x we have a large spread because we are in the state which maximally enlarges, maximally brings a back action. So this is a fairly different behavior from what was measured at Berkeley recently on an effective qubit. They measured at the same time sigma x and sigma y on an artificial qubit, and here what they got is a diffusive behavior on the equator, which never settles essentially. So here, since we measure an operator sigma minus which goes down, which in the end goes to the ground state, we do not observe this behavior, but a different kind of back action. So we have measured other kind of configuration. So here is an interesting one. It's the case where the dephasing channel has the same strength as the relaxation channel. And we do a very small Rabi drive. So this is the case indeed where both will tend to spread the distribution as much as they can, and actually similarly. And as you can see, this is the average trajectory. The stationary distribution is more spread here. Again, nothing on Y if you measure only sigma z. Now, if you measure only fluorescence, you will see that there is a much larger spread than in the previous experiment, where we measured sigma minus in presence of a strong Zeno blockade. So here it's you can see actually that it's kind of a hat that goes around a sphere here. And so finally, if you measure both, well, again, there will be a strong manifestation of the incompatibility between the two measurements in the fact that there is a very large spread in all of them, a larger spread than if we were to measure only one of the two channels. As you can see here, these last two distributions have the larger spread. Okay, so we have measured, in fact, many possible configurations, and this will be soon on our website. So if you want to, maybe can we commute the screen? Yes. So this will be on our website if you want to look at it. So these are not simulations, right? We have So you have this interface where you can choose, for instance, well, to tune Omega Rabi and choose the. Okay, so this is an example where we have a very large Rabi frequency. Well, this went back. Let's. Okay, so very large Rabi frequency, and we just measure dispersive. Is it now? Yeah. Let's look at this. So it's not still on our website because, as you can see, it's beta, but it will soon. You will soon be able to look at all the possible values of all the possible configurations of this rate, TD phasing and Omega Rabi compared to gamma 1. But now it's yeah, it doesn't seem to work exactly as planned now. Okay, it will soon be available. Can we go back maybe? Or? Thanks. All right, so I can. So maybe it's yeah. I think I'm a bit 10 minutes. Okay, perfect. So let me tell you a bit about what we can do with these measurements records. Apart from calculating their trajectories, we can in fact realize a measurement-based feedback with them. So the goal here would be to have this two-level system, measure its state either by dispersive measurement or fluorescence, and using the measurement records in real time, do a feedback control to stabilize a given state or a given trajectory, for instance. So the case of dispersive measurement was done, including by us some time ago now, and it's now quite a standard technique. I will show it to you, and we have recently realized it with fluorescence, which first of all is compatible with the dispersive case, so we can do both feedback at the same time. It converges in a time t1 for any state, whereas the dispersive case does not, and it's in fact more efficient in some way. So let's look first at the dispersive case. So in the dispersive case, we realize this experiment, which is quite simple, where we have a two-level system. Let's say we want to stabilize a given state or a given trajectory. What we do is we measure the state of the qubit dispersively, so measuring sigma z, send the outcome to a controller, which in our case was an FPGA, so a field programmable gate array. So this controller detects if the qubit is in ground or excited. If it's in the right state, then it does nothing, and if it's not in the right state, it does a pi pulse, so that it can prepare the right state. So this was quite elementary. So with this, we could stabilize Rabi and Ramsey oscillation. So here is an example of a Rabi oscillation without feedback. So you start here. So ideally, the Rabi oscillation will be going around the meridian forever. But in fact, due to decoherence, it decays down to the most entropic state in the center of the sphere. And here, with this simple feedback, which says that at each rotation, we check if the qubit is actually on the North Pole or not. And if it's not, we get it to the North Pole. You see that we can stabilize forever a Rabi oscillation. So this was done also in an analog manner at Berkeley before us, and the single step of reset by feedback was done at Delft also earlier. But with this technique of doing this stroboscopic feedback, so the fact that we choose when the feedback occurs, we modulate the strength of the feedback if you want. We could also stabilize Ramsey oscillation. So here is what happens without feedback. If we start from the equator and we let the qubit evolve, it will slowly decay to the ground state by first dephasing and then decaying. And if instead we use the feedback scheme we just discussed, so this time what we do is periodically we check whether or not the qubit is at the proper point on the equator doing a pi/2 pulse, checking that it's at the North Pole and not at the South Pole, doing a feedback and then getting back to the equator. You see that we could stay on average on the equator with a very high fidelity. Yeah? Okay, so this was the dispersive case. Now, what can we do with the fluorescence case? So in the fluorescence feedback case, fluorescence-based feedback, the goal is to stabilize a given target state. So any state of the Bloch sphere is fine. So here parameterized by the latitude theta and longitude phi. And so how do we compensate for the stochastic kicks due to fluorescence? So the measurement back action of fluorescence will induce kicks either in x and y, or if on the equator it will be around z or y here. And so in order to compensate for these kicks in real time, we need to use actually the three rotation axes. So we will use control fields on x, y, and z simultaneously. So there were previous proposals to realize feedback by fluorescence. So the first one was by Hoffman and Mahler, and they found a way to stabilize the southern hemisphere only. Then Wang and Wiseman found a way to stabilize every state but the equator. And what we did in collaboration with Pierre Rouchon is to find a way to stabilize any state of the Bloch sphere, including the equator. So the trick is to use both quadratures of the field, again, so I and Q, and send them to a controller, a linear controller, Markovian one, so we don't need to know what was the state of the qubit before time t to know what to do. And from this linear controller, we will send a control field around the x, y, and z axis of the drive. So this is actually the first instance of a multiple input and multiple output feedback in the quantum regime. So more precisely, so Pierre found a control law in the case of unit efficiency, which works well. So maybe it's not time to enter into the details, but so here we just simply extended it to non-unity efficiency, and so as you can see, we use we use different kind of analog feedback boxes to realize the precise shape of the control we want, and the result is that it's so it's possible with an efficiency here of the detector which was around 33%, I think. We could stabilize not the Bloch sphere because it's not unit efficiency, but we could stabilize the red points. So you see, aiming at this meridian, we actually got these red points. So first of all, you see it's possible to have to stabilize a state with more than 1/2 of excitation. So this is already a success. And also it's possible to stabilize a point towards the equator, so not at the equator here, but towards the equator. Okay, so maybe I should conclude now. So I hope you're convinced that the superconducting circuits are a test bed for probing quantum measurement back action, so we can demonstrate, observe quantum trajectories, realize feedback. So I didn't have time for this, but Michel will talk about this tomorrow in the context of cavity QED. We can also probe with this the impact of post-selection and look at retrodiction and quantum smoothing with these systems. We have a work in this direction here. And we can also use superconducting circuits to look at another kind of measurement back action, which is quantum xenodynamics. And also there is entanglement by measurements, the link with thermodynamics, etc. In the very near future, what we're going to do with the experiment I showed you is precisely look at the quantum smoothing. So the fact that you can better. So you see, we have two observers: one which observes fluorescence, one which observes sigma z. So we can say, for instance, what we can try to predict best. What the observer that measured fluorescence saw, knowing the entire measurement record until the end of time of the observer that measured sigma z. So this is something we're going to do. And we can do the statistics of pre-selected outcomes. There seems to be an anomalous behavior for fluorescence that we're trying to understand now. And maybe later go to higher dimensions, going away from the qubits. So this work was done, so in particularly the latest one by Quentin Fischer, who's there, and Sébastien Gézoin, who was a postdoc and now at Sherbrooke, and the rest of the team is here, and I thank you for your attention.
So the story and the storytelling were really great. A question, it's about the efficiency. Despite you are able to reconstruct all the trajectories, despite the fact that the efficiency figures are not close to 100%.
Yeah.
Can you explain that? And in the end, can you explain the relation between your last piece of experiment and quantum error correction?
Okay, so yes, so for the first part, so indeed the efficiency. So for dispersive measurement, it's usual for us to get 30%. For 14%, we were disappointed, of course. This is it works, but it works also because what I show you here are trajectories with a rabbit drive, and with a rabbit drive, you see that the ground safe will end up. We'll end up there in the end. So if we were instead to do as in our previous experiment where we saw quantum jumps, so we didn't do any drive. We started from the equator and just waited to see what the trajectory would look like. With such a low efficiency, in this case, it would quickly go to the ground state, and we wouldn't see much. But with the rabbit drive, in a sense, you can still see a lot of things, even with a low efficiency, indeed. And so the technical reason why we didn't get more is unknown to me. We tried a lot of things, and yeah, we don't know. There are more components than before because we have these two paths, the duplexer and everything, but it doesn't match quantitatively what we expect. Now, on the regarding quantum error correction, so I think in the end, for a quantum processor to work, we will need two kinds of correction. So one is the correction by reservoir engineering. So the autonomous error correction. But another stage, which would be to use also measurement-based feedback. And this can in fact be used to, for instance, this was used actually in the group of Rob Scholkopf for their very complicated experiment where they try to stabilize a Schrödinger cat state, the parity of a Schrödinger cat state. This can be used to, for instance, in real time, get the system in the state which is the less decoherent. So you can, with this kind of scheme, track the state of the system in time, and make it so that the system stays all the time in the state where it will less decohere. I think this would be an important resource for this.
We have time for another question, maybe. Shall?
You mentioned that when you made a strong measurement of the system, you got the nice surprise that the reconstruction of quantum trajectories worked extremely well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think
yes.
It's a very beautiful experiment, but why is it a surprise?
So yes. So you mentioned the fact that here in the case where we have indeed very strong measurements, this departs a bit from the limits that are allowed by the stochastic master equation approach. You see, in these measurements, we are limited in the time step of the measurement record by the bandwidth of the detector. So in our case, our time step is 100 nanoseconds. So here, if when we are at this measurement strength, the rate here of the measurement is higher than is so high that 100 nanoseconds times this rate is of order 1. And this is not allowed for say. This should not work in principle for stochastic master equation. It should stay much smaller than 1. So, but indeed, it seems that it still works fine. And so maybe I should insist on the fact that we indeed use the same. Oh, sorry, I'm going too fast. So we are, yeah. We are using the same efficiency, same parameters for all times and all values of measurement strength and Rabi oscillation. So it's not varying by a factor 2 in the model. So there is a strong constraint to the model, and still it works fine. There is actually a result by Pierre. About the fact that so the fluorescence, the stochastic master equation with fluorescence with sigma minus should be more robust to having a large time step dt because it's the sigma minus squared is 0 essentially, but sigma z squared is not 0, and we should not be able to do this in principle. But okay, so so it's because sigma z squared is 1. Okay. So maybe we're allowed to do it.
Okay,